Hey there, welcome back to another review, this time of the 1982 horror film remake, Cat People. Now, it's rather fitting that you get the first glimpse of Olympus in my review of Cat People, talking about a movie that features cats rather prominently, and I also have a cat featured in the video pretty prominently as well. But anyway, let's actually get to the review. This is a film that I saw a while back, and I remember liking it okay, but I remember wanting some more from it. Like I wanted a little bit more than what I got from the film. And overall, I still kind of feel the same way about it. But I would say I'm a bigger fan of it than I was the first time around. Also, it's a film that I would have to say is probably one of the better remakes I can think of. But also, I'm not really a big fan of the original Cat People, and I've tried to get into it. It just isn't my cup of tea. So that's another thing. I mean, if you're a really huge fan of the original and you think it's just absolutely great and it's one of those rare films, it's a masterpiece, then I could see why you would be disappointed or upset with this film and this adaptation of the story, because it's a whole different approach. It's pretty much the only thing that's really similar to the original Cat People by Val Lewton, I think that's how you say his last name, is the pool sequence and the title. Everything else is completely different. And there's like another scene too, like where this older woman encounters Irina at a bar and calls her mi hermana, my hermana, and that's kind of similar to the kind of thing you saw in the original. Cat People is directed by Paul Schrader, and Paul Schrader had before this written and directed films like American Gigolo, and I believe he also did Hardcore, which is a really underrated suspense. I don't know if it's a suspense thriller, but it's definitely a thriller, and I would have to say it's pretty underrated. It features a great performance by George C. Scott and a pretty intense storyline. Now, he chose to do this film because he wanted to do something different. He wanted to branch out and do films that didn't deal with street level drama, something that was more fantasy. It was more of a fantasy type of a film and a story. He wanted to do something that was out of his comfort zone. And I think his direction in this is easily one of the best things about the film. You can tell Paul Schrader is not only a great writer, but he's an equally great director, because he had a really great visual flair in this particular film. I love the style. I love the way he set up his shots. I love the pans. It was just a very unique type of style for a director. It was very pre-planned. There wasn't a lot of improvisation. You could tell that he was very skilled with the way he blocked a lot of these sequences and a lot of these scenes in the film. It's most notable in scenes like when Irina is naked running through the woods and you see her point of view as if she's kind of looking through the eyes of a cat, and other scenes as well, like the reveal of the second victim of Malcolm McDowell's character, his animal rampage, the way that the camera pans around the room, and it looks like there's been a struggle, but you really don't know how bad things got until you see a severed hand, and then it pans down to a absolutely mutilated, bloody corpse. That kind of stuff is really the type of things that stand out about the film for me personally. Just the direction and the way he shot sequences at night, and the way he worked with his cinematographer John Bailey, and his production designer, who was not credited in the film for reasons. I believe it was something to do with the I'm trying to think of the right word. It's the union, the union at the time, because the actual production designer, it was Ferdinando Scarfatti, but he was credited as a visual consultant because he was not a member of the right union at the time, so he cannot really have his name on the credits. He's also another reason why the film looks as lavish as it does. It's a very lavish looking movie. The production design is quite stunning, to be honest, and as is the art direction. The score by Giorgio Moroder is a real standout. I would also say that is one of the film's strongest points. I love his music. I've always been a big fan of Giorgio Moroder. I think he's an underrated director. I mean, not really a director. I mean, he doesn't ever really direct anything. He's an underrated music director. He's an underrated composer. He's done a lot of things like Scarface and a few other things, and he's well known in a lot of circles. But this is a guy who I don't feel really got enough credit for his composing work, because a lot of his film scores are not really that, let's just say, not really that either that well known or really not that well appreciated by a lot of his peers. But his synthesizer work is second to none, and his score for Cat People is a prime example of Moroder's talents as a composer. He adds this ethereal quality to the film that really wouldn't be there without his score, and he really is a one of a kind talent. The film has a screenplay written by DeWitt Bodine and Alan Ormsby, as well as an uncredited Paul Schrader, who is the one who's responsible for changing the ending. The ending was originally more of a traditional sort of ending for this type of movie, where the monster's in an old dark house and they kill the monster and the movie's over. He decided he wanted to have it different. He wanted to have John Hurt's character fully embrace his obsession with Irina and end up tying her up in a bondage moment, pretty much bonding her to her cat form and enabling her to remain alive, but also enabling her to remain to be this pet, this sex kitten for him, in the form of a panther. So he can just, have her locked up and always have that facet of that. I don't know if facet's the right word, but always have that the ability to be able to go to her cage and show her affection, to keep her caged like an animal that he can go in and give attention to whenever he would like. So yeah, that is, it's a very kinky ending to the film, and for a film that's more of an erotic thriller than a true horror film, I thought the ending actually fit the film rather well, and it's a unique type of way to end a film, and I would have to say that is another reason why I like the movie. I don't love the film for a few reasons, and I'll talk about those pretty soon, but I like the film for a lot of ways because of how unique it is, by the way, how the way the film ends, with other elements of the film's production, the art direction, the cinematography, the directing, as well as, there were quite a few performances by the actors that I thought were actually quite impressive. For one, Nastassja Kinski is just absolutely gorgeous in this. I don't think she's ever been hotter on camera than she is in this movie in Cat People. She is a one-of-a-kind beauty, and every curve and every just wonderful aspect of her, every just beautiful part of her body is on display in this film. I would have to say the closest I've seen to a film that really does capture the natural beauty in all of its glory, of beautiful women, I would probably say is probably Life Force with Matilda May. You see a lot more of Matilda May in Life Force than you do of Nastassja in this film, but you still see quite a bit. I mean, you see everything. And the way that it's shot is in a way that it doesn't really feel like it's sleazy to me. It doesn't feel like there's not really this voyeuristic aspect to it. It just seems like it's a way for this character to fully embrace her animal instinct, because she doesn't really go out in the nude until a particular point in the film where she's really starting to embrace who she really is, the animal within her. I also thought she was perfectly cast as a female cat, pretty much. She's a sex kitten. She was known for being a sex kitten for most of her career, and it was perfect casting to have her in this role. And also the way that she acts, the way that she behaves, carries herself is very feline, and that's because she also studied a lot of cats' movements to enhance her performance, and it definitely shows. But also, she's just a very talented actress. And sadly, she didn't really do a lot after this. This was her last shining moment in the sun, and that's really too bad. Now, Malcolm McDowell is also in this film as Paul Gallier, and then Nastassja Kinski plays Irina, and he is a long-lost brother of hers who shows up in the film early on. And there's this sort of incestuous relationship that's kind of hinted at, but it's never really a major plot point. But it is a tragic thing to know that if you're in Irina's shoes, she can't have sex, because if she has sex with anybody else, she can have sex, but she can only have sex with her brother without consequences. Because if she has sex with anybody else, any other person other than her brother, if she doesn't perform incest, she turns into a panther. So it's one of those things. It's like, it's this struggle between, should I embrace my animal instincts, or should I, commit an incest? This is just disgusting act of sexual deviancy. It's one of those things that's like, which one is worse? Turning into a panther and having to kill people in order to go back to being human, or having sex with my brother? It's one of those things where it's a very tough choice. There's no easy choice, and that's what makes some of the conflicts in the film rather interesting. And Malcolm McDowell is great in this too. I would say it's definitely one of his best acting roles for me. He nails the animalistic attitude of the character he's playing, and honestly, he's quite intimidating on more than one occasion. The late John Hurd is also in this as Oliver Yates, and this is another prime example of why he will be missed. John is a very underrated actor, and he plays the perfect everyman, and Oliver Yates is a perfect representation of the perfect everyman. He's a very likable guy. He's got some problems, though. He's not perfect. He does have this obsession with Irina, and it gets a little bit out of control at the end, but you can also twist it in a way that he actually ended up saving her by keeping her as his pet. But there's still some pretty twisted stuff behind that. Some twisted intentions behind what he did near the end of the film. You also have Annette O'Toole, who is just lovely in this, and she's lovely in anything. I've always been a big fan of her ever since I saw Superman 3 and her performance as Lana Lang. And she was kind of a last-minute casting choice to play this role as Alice, because I think Deborah Harry was the original choice, but she couldn't make it. So they ended up going with Annette O'Toole, and she has this nice warmth to her character. And she's also strong when she needs to be as well. She's not a total weakling. She carries a shotgun well enough, and she's actually the one that actually is responsible for dispatching Paul in his cat form later in the film. You also have Ed Begley Jr., who has a little bit role as Joe Cray, who's another guy who works at the zoo. Scott Paulin, who you might recognize, he has been in a few films. He was in the Captain America film, the 1990 Captain America movie, as the Red Skull. He was also in a absolutely fantastic episode of the 80s Twilight Zone called Nightcrawlers. And he's in this in a bit role. You also have John Larroquette, who has a role as like this guy who I think he is one of the men who's like funding the zoo. So he has a little bit part here as Bront Judson. And you also have Lynn Lowry, who plays Ruthie, who is this prostitute who is the first one that becomes a victim of Paul in his panther form. Now, the film's plot, the screenplay, it has its moments. I like the slow build. I like the slow burn aspect of it. The building up to Irina transforming into a cat. And the effects by Tom Berman are just... I think they're some of the best of this particular era. I would rank it right up there with the Rob Bottin's work for The Howling or Rick Baker's work for An American Werewolf in London. And I don't understand some of the comments by some of the people involved with this film, thinking that if it was done now, it would look better. And you hear a lot of that in some of the features on this, as well as some of the features on this DVD. And I just don't really quite understand that. I don't get the whole, oh, the effects would be better type deal nowadays than they are in this film. I don't get it, because the effects in this are done for real, and that's why scenes like when Ed Begley Jr.'s character gets his arm ripped off, that's why they're so visceral. That's why they're so intense. It's because it's shot for real with practical effects. That's why the sequence when Irene is transforming is such a shocking sequence. It's such it makes you clutch the grip of your chair. You know, it's one of those gripping moments in cinema because of the practical effects by Tom Berman. I wouldn't want it any other way. I wish I saw a little bit more of that, like more of Paul, more of Malcolm McDowell in his half-human, half-cat form. I don't think they showed enough of that. And for me personally, I probably would have liked a little bit more gore, a little bit more chase scenes, tiny bit more action. I would have tightened up the pacing, and I think in order to do that, you would have to focus more on the horror elements of the film. I get it. It's more of an erotic thriller. It's more of an erotic thriller with horror elements, as evidenced by this poster. I mean, come on. I mean, they clearly knew what kind of film they were trying to make here. I mean, it doesn't get more slutty or porny, you know, than this poster. I mean, she's literally wet. But anyway, I'm not going to complain though, because Nastassja Kinski is absolutely gorgeous, so I'm not really going to complain. But yeah, I mean, come on, they knew exactly what kind of movie they were making. But that being said, I think they still could have amped up the horror elements in it, because that was the main selling point for a lot of people. It wasn't the eroticism, it wasn't that. It was, oh, David Bowie's doing the soundtrack, and you have like it's a horror film. It's a remake of an older movie called Cat People, and that was the selling point for the movie. It was Universal's kind of answer to An American Werewolf in London or something like that. You know, it was not really that kind of. I don't get the whole like selling point of it just being an erotic movie, because there really weren't a lot of erotic movies at this particular time period that were really big hits. So yeah, that part kind of escaped me. American Gigolo, I guess you could say, is an erotic film, but that's not a horror movie. It's not marketed as a horror film, so it's a completely different type of genre and a different approach. That being said, the budget's well used. It's got a $12.5 million budget, and it's used to its fruition for the most part, especially for building an entire zoo based on I keep trying to think of different words other than wonderful or great or amazing, or, you know, because there's just so many different ways to say the word, say great, you know, and then once you've said them all, it's just kind of hard to really be anything different. But, you know, how about this? I would say they're stupendous designs. They really are. And so they were used to create the zoo that's featured a lot in the film. That was a set. I mean, it wasn't the zoo that you see in the film doesn't actually exist. So that's another feather in this film's cap, or another scratch on the post, so to speak. But yeah, the budget's used really well for the sets and for the effects and all of that. And in the sequences where it's takes place in a dream, that was all on a soundstage, and there was a lot of work put into that, and it shows. And maybe it cost them a decent amount of money to get David Bowie and other people involved with the film too, but $12.5 million is definitely a pretty high budget for the time, and it's definitely on the screen. So it's not one of those films where it doesn't look like it's like it costs as much as the budget was. It made $21 million in the U.S. box office, so it did okay, but it wasn't a big hit, and Universal was fairly disappointed with it. But the film went on to be a cult classic, and I can see why. I mean, it's like I said, it's a very visually striking and stunning film. I wish the script could have had a little bit more going on. The love story between Nastassja Kinski's character Irina and John Hurd's character Paul. No, he's not Paul. He's Oliver Yates. Oliver Yates. That was actually quite effective. I wish it kind of started a little bit earlier in the film where they had more of it, and it felt like it was kind of going back and forth between these two characters. So you had these character moments for Nastassja Kinski's character Irina, and then you had these character moments for Malcolm McDowell, and it didn't really feel like those two characters to me kind of meshed. So they were supposed to be brothers, but it didn't. The conflict between the two was interesting, but it never really felt like this was something that I didn't feel like the stakes were that high. I felt the stakes were higher with Irina and Oliver than I did with Paul and Irina. But, McDowell does a great job with the role. It's just the kind of person I am. I just kind of prefer a little bit more action, maybe a little bit more gore, a little bit more intrigue with the script and the story, and also, a little bit more humor. This film kind of takes itself a bit too seriously at times, which also hurts the pacing, because you can have some fun with this, like American Werewolf in London did, and other films like this, but it just never really does that. It gets kind of pretentious at times, which I'm not too fond of. But there are a decent amount of things about it that I liked, and it's a film that I would probably recommend the movie if it sounds interesting to you. If the concept intrigues you, if it's something that sounds like it's right up your alley, or if you just want to see Nastassja Kinski in the film in all of her beautiful glory, then I guess you could check it out for that as well. It's definitely worth a watch for that aspect. But yeah, I've seen better horror remakes, but I've also seen a lot worse. Overall, I liked it. I'm glad I have this Blu-ray thanks to Jonathan Lindsay. The Blu-ray itself, it's a bit of a letdown. It's definitely one of Scream Factory's more mediocre releases. The features don't even equate to being an hour in length. The longest interview is around like 9 to 10 minutes, and a lot of them are really short. And there are some interesting anecdotes. The longest one, I think, is by Annette O'Toole, and it's my favorite interview on this particular Blu-ray. Nastassja Kinski's interview was very short. She looked like she was high as balls. Looked like something was wrong with her, and maybe that's why it was so short. But she didn't really have much to offer or anything to really say that was that particularly interesting. John Hurd had some fun lines, some fun things to talk about, like how Malcolm McDowell was talking about how you would upset a Frenchman, you just ruffle his shirt because they're so obsessed with how they look. And it was really nice to hear and see John again. And it was nice to hear from him. A bit bittersweet considering he's passed away recently, but it was still nice to see an interview with John. It was pretty short though. Malcolm McDowell was a nice one. It was a fun little bit of trivia that he he really he thought that the film was a porno, and he was leery of signing on to it at first, but then he found out that it really wasn't a porno, but it kind of does have some porn elements in it, to be perfectly honest. But it's not a straight up porno, but yeah, I could see why you'd feel that way. The other interviews you had with Paul Schrader and Roger Vadim, they were okay. And then I had the trailer and some photo galleries and stuff like that. But what's really disappointing is that the features that were on this DVD, this collector's edition, this special edition DVD from Universal, are not on the Scream Factory release. So you have this much better interview with Paul Schrader, Cat People and Intimate Portrait, which is over 20 minutes, which is a much better interview, with a lot more information on the making of the movie and what he did and what was going on with the film versus what was covered on the Blu-ray. It also has a commentary track with Paul, which is nowhere to be found on the Scream Factory Collector's Edition, an on-set interview with him from around the time of the film's release, and a really nice short interview with Tom Berman about the practical effects. And so none of that is on the Collector's Edition from Scream Factory. So the fact that it doesn't port over features from the original release, that is definitely disappointing. But the picture quality is probably some of the best you'll see from this film. It sounds great. It's especially great to hear David Bowie's Putting Out the Fire with Gasoline and with high definition sound, as well as hearing Giorgio Moroder's score. And I'm glad it's one I'm glad I have, but I would recommend not paying full price for this, especially if you're not a fan of the film. If you're a fan of the film, go ahead, pay full price. But I would say it's not really worth that. I get it used for cheap, and I think you can get that. This is one you can get a little bit easier nowadays because it isn't really one of the best releases. It's an earlier release. It was from 2015, so it's one of their first kind of releases. But it's still kind of disappointing considering I'm gonna have to keep this DVD because that's if I get rid of it, then I don't have some of the best features when it comes to the making of this film. I think the interview with Schrader is a million times better in this, and the interview with Tom Berman is very valuable to me. It's an invaluable interview, and there's not even a new interview with Tom on this Blu-ray. So yeah, it's a letdown, but it's worth having for your collection. But if you are not the biggest fan of the film and you just have this DVD, I'd probably recommend just keeping it, because I wouldn't say it's really worth it to spend money on this Blu-ray unless you're a really big fan of the film, or you want to hear some of the interviews, which some of the stuff that's mentioned is kind of interesting. And I don't want to give away some of it, so that those of you who haven't seen any of the interviews, you can see them for yourself. But anyway, I really don't know what else to say about Cat People, except if I was going to rate it out of 5 stars, I would give the film as a whole 3.5 out of 5 stars, which is kind of a similar rating to that Roger Ebert gave it. He gave it 3.5 out of 4, but I would give it 3.5 out of 5 because it's not quite a 4-star flick for me, because it has some pacing issues. I would have liked to have a little bit more gore, a little bit more action, a little bit more intrigue. I would have liked the plot to be a little bit less muddled. And some of the pretentious aspects of the film I did not care for. And I definitely would have liked to have seen more humor interjected into the film. I understand that's not the type of the movie they were trying to make, but it's kind of hard to take a werecat movie that seriously. So it would have been a nice change of pace at times to kind of have a little bit of fun with it. But overall, it's an all right. It's an above average horror remake, and yeah, I don't know what else to say about the film except thanks for watching, and as always, I will see you guys later. See ya.